happening. And everyone knows this is an important topic in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of literature on the labor market effects, especially kind of marginal licenses that differ between states. So recent papers have shown large reductions in labor supply into licensed occupations, changes in the composition of workers in licensed occupations, higher prices for goods and service offered by licensed workers, and then a substantial wage premium on the order of 10 to 30%, and then as well as lower interstate migration. So we know that there are some clear consequences of licensure across these states. But what I want to focus on a little bit is this initial evidence of spillovers in the ways in which licenses in one occupation may affect the labor market outcomes of other occupations. So to give three clear examples from the recent literature, so regulations for physical therapists, particularly direct access to patients, seems to have a negative effect on the wages of occupational therapists. In addition, broader nurse practitioner scope of practice laws leads to physicians' wages going down, but nurse practitioner wages going up, in part because the services offered by those two occupations can be quite substitutable in some margins. And then in dental health, broader scope of practice, particularly the ability for dental hygienists to be self-employed, leads to earnings and employment for dentists going down, and then wages and employment of hygienists going up. The authors in that paper, which I think is really interesting, they kind of couch this in this idea that tighter scope of practice laws may lead to conditions in the labor market reminiscent of monopsony power, in that dentists are the sole buyer in these tight scope of practice states. Dentists are the sole buyer of the labor of dental hygienists, and therefore can bid down the wages. So the research questions I'm going to focus on is, given the fact that we see these effects on wages, lower entry, and migration, I'm going to look at the spillover effects of licensing. So first is, how does licensure affect earnings and occupations which use similar skills? And I'll define what I mean by similar skills in just a minute. And the second is, how do those effects differ across demographic groups? Different demographic groups may be more or less likely to be able to absorb occupational licensing costs, and some of them may be more likely to be categorically ineligible for reasons for incarceration bans, as well as language requirements, as well as citizenship or residency requirements as well. And the third question is, are those effects driven by labor supply shifts into the remaining unlicensed occupation, or may there be an increase in monopsony power due to a lack of outside options for unlicensed individuals? And then lastly, how does the licensing affect the composition of workers in those other occupations? So what I'm going to do in this paper, to give you kind of a broad overview, is I'm going to use skill data from ONET to cluster occupations together based on their skill content with some non-parametric clustering techniques. And I'll kind of walk through kind of my thinking on using those skill dimensions. And then I'll use the individual licensing data from the CPS to determine the share of workers in a cluster licensed outside of one's own occupation, which I'm going to call the focal occupation. So excluding one's own occupation, how does licensure, what share of workers are licensed in every other occupation in the cluster? And then I'm going to use a state border discontinuity design with occupation, state, and border fixed effects in the ACS using local labor markets at the PUMA, the public use microdata area level, to estimate those spillover effects on earnings. So identification from that comes purely from cross-border differences in the cluster license shares in the same occupation. And then I'll use that to estimate the effects on worker compositions rather than wages as the outcome. I'll look at indicators for race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And then look at occupation-specific employment in that local labor market to explore some of the mechanisms through which these wage effects might be happening. And then I'll contextualize some of those effects with two models of how barriers to entry could influence the labor market. So to give you a preview of the results, a 10 percentage point increase in the share of licensed workers in other occupations in your own skill cluster leads to 2 to 2.5% decline in earnings within your own occupation. So that is to say, if every other worker in your skill cluster outside your occupation were licensed, that would lower your earnings by between 20 to 25% on average. Granted, that's a large increase in licensure, so looking at this smaller margin, I think, is helpful. There are larger spillovers for women, non-Hispanic, Black, and foreign-born Hispanic workers. So those penalties are closer to the order of 3 to 4%. And then a decline in the share of workers in the focal occupation that are women or have advanced degrees happens as other occupations become licensed. So what that says to me is that you have people who are required to have an advanced degree who can't get one end up being pushed into the remaining unlicensed occupations. And then an increase in the share of workers in the focal occupation that are Hispanic or foreign-born. So in addition to people who may not be able to attain, say, a master's degree to go into a particular occupation that requires a license, you see other people who may have trouble overcoming those borders or categorical ineligibility, such as people with residency requirements. Hispanic and foreign-born workers funnel out of those licensed occupations and into the remaining unlicensed occupations within the same skill cluster. And then despite some within cluster sorting, overall employment in that focal occupation falls. And to me, that's suggestive of monopsony power leading to falling earnings and lower employment in those focal occupations. So just to kind of go through the contributions real quick, I'm first to show that the wage premium and the consumer protections in licensed occupation, if you generalize that to more and more occupations, that is going to come at a cost. And that is lower earnings and employment for other workers who use similar skills. And that's going to be particularly salient to people who are already more likely to be low SES. And it leads to more occupational segregation by sex, ethnicity, and nativity. And then I'm going to use kind of two existing models with some clear predictions for labor supply response to barriers. And then I show that it may be that firm market power may be able to explain some of this effect. I go into more detail in this in the paper, but in the interest of time, I'll kind of generalize here. This model, the Catherine Shaw, makes some clear predictions about how transferability of the skills between occupations determines the switching behavior and then the development of occupation-specific human capital. And I'm going to adapt that model with some occupational choice based on the best matches with one's latent skills, endowed or acquired. But the main two predictions of this model is that the greater the skill transferability between occupations, the more probable is a move between the two occupations. And so, for example, if someone is wants to be a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, the skill transferability between those two occupations is quite high. And so one may choose to go into one or the other based on that similarity. But the lower the opportunities for investment in an occupation I, say, will increase the value of moving to an occupation J. So as the requirements for an occupation, say physical therapy, for example, are higher, that increases the value of moving into, say, occupational therapy, occupation J. So how licenses factor there is categorical ineligibility may make a move almost certain. But then differential costs that arise with education, exams, or fees without any offsetting returns may also shift individuals between occupations, and they will be more likely to move into an occupation with a similar skill complementarity. And then what that says is that the labor supply in those remaining occupations within the cluster is going to increase as those wages decrease. And that's a simple kind of labor supply prediction. That as workers are deterred from going into an occupation because of these high barriers to entry, that they will increasingly enter the remaining occupations within that same skill cluster, drive down wages, drive up the labor supply. The opposite kind of prediction can be made from a monopsony model. So I really like this model Dan Black proposes. There's a search model in which prejudice firms refuse to hire black workers. And unprejudiced firms do hire black workers, but are rarer. And that relative rarity of unprejudiced firms increases the search costs. So in that model, it lowers the reservation wages and increases monopsony power of the unprejudiced firms over black workers. So you can think to adapt that model where widespread licensing across occupations increases the share of quote unquote prejudiced firms who can only hire a licensed worker. What that does is it lowers the number of outside options, raises search costs, lowers reservation wage and or the labor elasticity to the current firm at the current wage. And so Isla got into that with some nice detail about looking at some of those labor market dynamics. And I think that this dovetails quite nicely with Morris's work about switching behavior. If you're less likely to switch, you may be offered a lower wage because the threat of leaving as your outside options are limited is lower. So I can kind of quickly go through this model here. So say that there is a theta share of firms who, due to their product markets, will hire unlicensed workers with skills in some sort of skill cluster defined as S. Those with a license, L, and those without a license, and will face wage offers from the unprejudiced firms of omega UL and omega UN. But only licensed workers will receive a wage offer at the prejudiced firms. So you think of that as omega PL. And then think of some parameter alpha as the utility value of the job satisfaction in a particular firm occupation match with a probability density function. So the licensed worker is going to take a wage offer which matches their utility, the reservation utility, or when their job satisfaction is greater than the difference in this kind of reservation utility and the offered wage. And the same is true for unlicensed workers, except they cannot receive a wage offer from a prejudiced firm. The prediction here is really important. The worker without a license is going to continue to search until this marginal cost kappa of the next search is equal to the expectation of this wage offers, given the distribution of possible firm occupation matches and their level of satisfaction. But the unambiguous prediction here is that an increase in theta, the share of firms who only hire licensed workers in the skill cluster is going to increase the search costs and lower the reservation wage. And because firms recognize that, they can offer unlicensed workers lower wages. And so the measured elasticity of labor supply to the firm with respect to the offered wage goes down. And in a kind of a new monopsony framework that Manning talks about in his 2003 paper, that's the ability to, the threat of switching versus staying at the offered wage is a good measure of the ability for current firm employers to exploit. So they calls it the rate of exploitation, is this difference between the measured elasticity and what we think should be close to infinity. So a lower elasticity means that workers are stuck having lower wages because their outside options are lower. And those differential costs for theta are going to actually differ across demographic groups. So, Bobby is here today. One of his papers looks at the signal value of a license. So the premium there is going to be higher for some of these groups that may be historically discriminated against. But the negative effects of these types of spillovers may differentially affect Black workers if they can't get a license. And then English-only exams may differentially affect non-English speaking immigrants, half of which are Spanish speakers. And then citizenship or residency requirements are going to affect foreign-born workers differently than they would native-born workers. And what that implies in this model is the inability to access a greater share of the labor market in these occupations for which you could qualify given your skill set. Means that those spillover effects might be larger for those particular groups. And so some of the clear predictions from these models is that as licensing increases within the skill cluster, earnings in the remaining occupations will fall, and employment in the remaining occupations in the cluster will also fall. And that is because monopsonistic firms are going to hire fewer workers and pay them a lower wage. In addition, those earnings spillover effects are going to be larger for Black workers, foreign-born workers, and for women. There is some evidence from the monopsony literature that women supply labor to the firm with respect to the wage, they have a lower elasticity of that labor supply. And so that inelasticity means that employers may be able to pay women lower wages and not have a credible threat of them leaving at as high a rate as their male counterparts. And then in the recent literature on monopsonies, that suggests that labor markets are more concentrated with fewer firms with with larger effects of labor market concentrations in smaller labor markets. So if you have a smaller labor market, they're less likely to have multiple occupations or multiple jobs that you can move into if the current firm offers you a lower wage. And then the prediction here is that you may see composition shifts due to the differential costs of obtaining a license across these demographic groups. So as Morris was talking, the CPS asks these individual questions about licensing requirements for their jobs. So from that, I'm going to construct two key variables from which to measure kind of the regulatory environment. The first is the share of a worker's own census occupation code that is licensed in the state. And that's going to be a proxy for the regulatory environment for that particular occupation. Morris and Evan Soltis use that in their paper, and they do a lot of validation of that measure to try to see if there's something missing there, and it seems to come out pretty well. The second measure that's going to be important is going to be the share of workers in the same skill cluster outside that occupation, that focal occupation that's licensed in the state. And that will be the measure of the spillover effect. So as you're looking at pressure from other occupations that become more and more licensed, how does that affect my wage in my occupation given that pressure? What that does is it abstracts away from some of these individual unobservable determinants of licensure. So maybe you're just more likely to be able to absorb those costs because you've got more in savings or some other unobserved behavior. But it also allows for some heterogeneity in the sub-occupation categories. And that's going to be important. I have looked at trying to replicate this analysis using the Northwestern licensing database, and the results seem to be a lot of noise, in part because it's really difficult to map the text of a licensing law onto a census occupation code. And that's a difficulty that is going to be faced by anybody who's doing work in this area, is how do you actually assign the stringency or the requirements for one occupation if that's really just the requirements are just applying to a sub-occupation. So one example is in the CSOR, they show that there is a difference between anesthesiologist assistants and physician assistants in licensure across states. So for example, in Alabama and Mississippi, they have different licensing requirements for anesthesiologist assistant. But in the SOC codes, which is one of the more detailed codes that we have in the census or in other statistical agencies, those are all amalgamated underneath the physician assistant requirement or the physician assistant code, but those are also separately licensed. And so it becomes more and more difficult to measure these without a more granular measure of individual licensure. And that's what this measure is trying to get at. My estimation sample is going to come from the ACS. So I'm looking at the 5% sample of ACS in the public use microdata area geographic identifiers. So being able to look at kind of larger labor markets that border a state without the concern that I'm excluding a lot of border counties, for example, is going to be really important. So I'm defining border pumas here as those on or within 5 miles of the state border. So for example, if you're in a metro area that is not exact, in a large metro area where there are several pumas in that metro area, if you are not exactly on the border, but you are separated by just a few miles from the border, I'm including that. So I have this border sample that I've constructed along the state borders. And then the sample that I'm pulling is workers 18 to 64 in occupations that are not universally licensed. But my results are robust to including those universally licensed occupations. But the underlying rationale for that is that the behavior of occupations that are universally licensed might be quite different than those who have partial licenses or where that differs across states. So the main outcome I'm going to look at is the log of weekly earnings. So the reason for weekly earnings is because some of the hours measures in the ACS have been shown to vastly undercount typical work hours for part-time workers, which leads to astronomically high estimates of their wages. If you were just to take weekly earnings and divide it by hours, you have quite a few workers who have implausibly large wage estimates. So I'm going to look at log weekly earnings, which also takes into account the fact that if spillovers reduce the hours worked for unlicensed workers, that's going to be captured in this log weekly earnings measure, which I think which may be able to capture a little bit more kind of the general equilibrium effects here. But I've replicated this with the CPS using simply state and using state and occupation fixed effects, and I get very similar estimates of these spillovers. So to give you a sense of how my border sample is going to actually match up with the full sample of the ACS. So my sample is slightly more white and slightly less Hispanic and less foreign born. And this is going to be a struggle with anyone who tries to use a border discontinuity design. I know that Bobby and Peter have looked at this, and they find a similar kind of struggle. You have to exclude many of the coastal areas in California that have a large population of Hispanic and Asian migrants, as well as some of the inner counties and areas within Texas that have large populations that are Hispanic. So that may explain some of this. The external validity is obviously a question, but it doesn't seem to be a huge concern that I have so far, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. So overall, I've got about almost 1.5 million individuals in 244 PUMAs with 110 state border pairs. So then what I'm going to do, when I talked about the skills earlier, this is what I'm talking about. So I'm looking at the ONET data. I'm going to look at latent skills based on Asimov and Otter's kind of task intensity measures. And these are non-routine cognitive analytical tasks. You could think of that as something like doing math or having to do some sort of coding and analytical processing. Non-routine cognitive and interpersonal would be something like leadership skills, the ability to lead and direct and teach other people. Routine cognitive skills, routine manual skills, and then non-routine manual physical skills would be something like athletes or even repairmen, people who are tasked with fixing machines, where takes a lot of physical adaptability to be able to do that. And then non-routine interpersonal adaptability, which is really like the ability to be socially perceptive.
Sam?
Yeah.
We have a question from Ilya Kukev. His question is, does border sample vary much if you change 5 mile range for the pumas?
It does not. It only excludes, I think, about 20 of those pumas. A lot of them are drawn to share a lot of those borders. So it's not very sensitive to that specification, no. So kind of the underlying logic here is that once you get skills, once you have jobs that have a similar skill set, transitions between those are going to be more likely, even across industries. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be that if you're in a healthcare industry that you go and transfer into a job in the healthcare industry. It could be that if you were in the healthcare industry, say as a dental assistant, some of the skills that are used by dental assistants are also used by something like a clerk. And so those can be transferable even across industries. So to give you a sense of what I'm doing with the ONET data here, this left panel, think about it as just 2 dimensions of skill, and then each of these numbers as an occupation. And then the panel on the right is this dendrogram, or this tree that's constructed based on the distances between any 2 points. And so, and I've highlighted here these colors in purple so that you can see how the clusters develop. So occupation 5 and occupation 6 are obviously the closest 2 points within this left panel. So first, those 2 will be the ones that merge into a single cluster. and that forms the purple cluster. Then as you move up into kind of the distance between them, you come to this blue cluster where the purple cluster that was formed by 5 and 6 then merges with occupation number 4, and that creates the blue cluster. At the same time, you move over to occupations 1 and 2, which are about the same distance between 5 and 6, and slightly larger than the distance between 5 and 6 and 4, and those will merge together to form the yellow cluster. Now, if I were to say the maximum distance between those two has to be less than, say, 0.8, I would cut the tree right there and I would be left with 5 clusters. If you count the points here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the number of clusters that you have, is the number of lines that would intersect with that cut. Now, if I were to move up a little bit more, what I'd do is I'd get another cluster, the red cluster, by merging the yellow cluster with the red cluster formed from 1 and 2 with cluster 0. And then lastly, as you move up, you then engulf number 3, and eventually in this dendrogram, every occupation ends up in one cluster. And so the researcher has some degrees of freedom to be able to choose what are the cut points or how many clusters am I going to examine based on the data set. So what I'm going to do in these steps using kind of this framework is I'm going to look at the correlated distance between the occupations. That's just 1 minus the Pearson correlation coefficient between occupations across these measures. And the nice thing is that's not sensitive to the scale that's used for these measures.
Sam, another question
Yeah.
from Roy from the University of Alabama, Montgomery. How are you getting the distance?
Yeah, so the distance measure here is going to be the correlative distance. So it'll be 1 minus the Pearson correlation coefficient between those occupations. So you take all those measures and how they move together, and then look at it creates a matrix with the distance of range 0 to 2. So if they're perfectly inversely correlated, the distance will be 2. If they're perfectly correlated, the distance will be 0 for each of those occupation dyads. So it's collapsing down the dimensions into a single distance measure. So hopefully that more clearly answers the question. You can do this with, say, Euclidean distance between all of those individual measures, between each of the occupation dyads. That can be sensitive to scale. Using the Pearson correlation coefficient is exactly the same as standardizing any sort of Euclidean distance and then doing the same operation. So I'm going to use this hierarchical clustering to form the dendrogram based on what's called average linkage distance. And all that says is each point within a cluster is measured in distance from any other point occupation, so that it just means that the data values are going to be more robust to outliers within those clusters because you're taking into account the distance within the clusters. You can do this by taking the farthest point in the cluster or the nearest point in the cluster, but the results can be quite sensitive depending on if you use either one of those. Average linkage distance is much more robust to outliers and much more consistent depending on models that you use. And then there's this question, well, how many clusters are optimal? How many clusters do we think is the right number? You can do that data-driven, so you can use a number of kind of validators to look at the number of optimal clusters. I'm going to do that, but in the absence of some real agreement between those validation measures, I'm going to, for transparency, just show you the results for 4 to 20 clusters. I'm using 4 main validation measures. The optimum seems to be within the 14 to 20 range, but there's no clear winner. So I'm just going to present everything from 4 to 20 and kind of let you make up your mind about how you think these might be related. So here's the sanity check on this. So at 20 clusters, which means that these clusters have gotten smaller and smaller because the distance between them, the occupations, has gotten smaller and smaller. This is what we find. So cluster 1, I think, is going to be the most important because it's the largest of the clusters, and it contains a lot of kind of professional degree holders. So you got various managers, teachers, and then accountants. So these are the top 3 occupations within there, and they account for quite a bit of employment. But then moving down, you see, say, cluster 9, general office clerks, bookkeeping, accounting clerks, billing clerks, Then you've got, say, in number 12, you've got cashiers, stock clerks, maids and housekeepers, food prep workers. These workers use pretty similar sets of skills in in executing their job duties. So to me, that was a sanity check to say, well, does this make sense? Yes. Even across, say, industries. For example, insurance claims are different than accounting claims. So these are each kind of different, could be different industries, but use similar skills. So here's my equation for my border discontinuity design. So looking at individual I in occupation O in skill cluster C on state border M in state S. There's a lot of subscripts. So I'm including occupation, state, and border fixed effects, as well as...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I just wonder, going back to your last slide with the clusters there, is there... I remember doing tests as an undergrad about career recommendation, the optimal major for you based on different questions I would answer. So I assume those exist. I wonder if there's a way to just as a validation exercise, see if people who score similar, see if you have access to that. I might be asking too much because that might be too much work. But if there are other personality tests or I don't know what they are, but they told me that I should do something like X, Y, and Z, where some different majors that would be good for me based on my answers to questions. And that might be an interesting way to validate this, as opposed to just eyeballing it. But I think you're right that eyeballing it seems to a lot of it seems to make sense, but maybe there's other things you could correlate it with.
Yeah, that actually could be really helpful. There is another paper that looks at some of these skill dimensions and actual job-to-job transitions. That's in the monopsony literature, and it just came out that says that these kind of the distance between skills is very highly correlated with whether or not you see high frequency of those job-to-job transitions. That's based on burning glass data from individual resumes. But I like the measure of these skills because it is not endogenous to the reasons why you made a switch. And so that could be nice. And so I think that validation measure for like high school personality tests, things like that, could actually be really interesting as a validation test, because that's the information that students are getting in real time as they're starting to make some of these choices. So I think that could be a really cool validation measure. Thank you. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, so in this border discontinuity design, the identifying variation is going to come from cross-state differences in licensing status within the same occupations and clusters on either side of the state border. And so, one clear example for me, because I lived in the DC area, I lived in Northern Virginia, but a lot of people worked within DC and a lot of people worked within Maryland. And so if you were to look at that area, there are differences in licensure rules across those state borders and across those municipality borders. And so this would capture the variation and use that to leverage the estimates. I should say that in my vector X, I'm including sex, race, and ethnicity, age, and age squared. I'm not including education, in part because education, as Morris has shown in his other paper with Evan, does tend to increase education, or licensing increases education on the margin. What I'm hoping to do is say net of any sort of these other compositional shifts, what is the wage effect? And so I'm purposely not including that and trying to make it as stripped back as possible, but things are robust to those inclusions. But so what I'm doing is I'm comparing the workers in the same occupation on either side of a state border. And the assumption here is that conditional on all of those fixed effects, the licensing shares within each occupation are going to be exogenous. So that's to say that within kind of these shared labor markets on either side of the state border, you're going to see very similar kind of demand, very similar supply of other types of occupations, but for this exogenous licensing requirement.
A quick question, Sam, from Bobby. For your occupational fixed effect, at what digit level?
So I'm stuck using the 3-digit fixed effect from the CPS.
And then Morris also asked, can you use a distance gradient for state borders?
I can. That'll take a bit of work to get to the Puma centroids and measure the distance from the state border, but I think that I can do that. Let me write that down. One struggle with that will be in some of the less populated states. The Pumas can be quite large because they require at least 100,000 residents. So for like Wyoming, that's half the state. But yes, I think that might be an interesting check on kind of how distance may affect some of these estimates. Okay, so let's jump into some of these effects here. So here, each point on the line is a separate estimate, depending on the number of clusters that are included. So as you get up to 20, the identifying variation within clusters starts to shrink. But you see that the estimates are fairly consistent. So a 10 percentage point increase in licensure would lead to about 2% decline in wages. So this coefficient is based on 100% licensure for other occupations. The own occupation license effect here is on the order of about 9.5%, which is ballpark of what we see in the literature from other estimates as well. When you look at the breakdown between men and women, the wage premium for women is a lot larger than the wage premium for men, and so is the penalty for the within cluster spillovers. You see, to some extent, a smaller wage premium for men in general, but then also a much more muted wage penalty as well. And then I think some of the more interesting effects here are across race. So you see, comparing non-Hispanic white workers in the same occupation across state borders, the effects on non-Hispanic Black workers are larger. So the premium looks like it's about the same, but the spillover effects are quite large. So do you have an estimate of closer to negative 0.3 rather than negative 0.2 for most non-Hispanic Black workers versus non-Hispanic white workers. And then looking at nativity as well. So foreign-born non-Hispanic Black workers experience the largest spillovers that I've been able to see. They have the largest wage premium, in part due to what Bobby and Peter have shown as the signal value. If you can signal through a license that you have the skills necessary to do the job, then you might take a wage premium relative to what you would make otherwise. But you also see this pretty large spillover. So that could be a function of both language or residency requirements due to citizenship requirements, or labor market conditions that allow for more discrimination against some of these historically discriminated groups. So you may see the compounding of both the effect of being a Black worker affected by licenses and being a foreign-born worker. You see a similar difference between native-born Hispanic workers and foreign-born Hispanic workers. In fact, there's not really much of a wage premium to being for foreign-born Hispanic workers, and that's in part because there are very few of these foreign-born Hispanic workers that are able to attain those occupational licenses, in part because those are also required to be in English for many of those exams, as well as the costs of entry. And then looking at by the quartile of the size of the labor market, the size of the Puma. So more concentrated, you see more concentrated labor market effects in these smaller labor markets. So the spillover effects are quite large. You still see about a 10% gain in the wage. In more densely populated labor markets, you see much more muted both premium and spillovers. And then looking at the composition here, so this is for this is for 100% licensure outside your own occupation. What you see is that you see this shift in the share of individual workers who are Hispanic, who are foreign-born, to some extent maybe shifting downward in age. But this is the 18 to 25 was the only kind of remotely significant effect that I saw. We also see this large decline in PhD holding and master's degrees, as well as a pretty sizable decline in the share of workers who are women. So what that says is women are going into these licensed occupations and men are entering the remaining unlicensed occupations. So the share of men in the focal occupation is increasing. And then looking at the employment effects. So this is, I'm looking at log occupation employment within the PUMA as the outcome. And I've taken out all of the other kind of individual aspects of this. So the own occupation license effect is what we've seen in the literature before. There's between a 15 to 20% decline in labor supply. But we also see here is that the employment for the spillover effects goes down by almost a similar degree, about 10% once you get to 20 clusters. So what that says is it's not that individuals are funneling out of the licensed occupation and into the remaining occupations within the skill cluster, is that the overall employment in that remaining occupation that's left out is still declining. And that's despite some within cluster sorting. So this is the log occupation share of the cluster PUMA cell. So the share of workers within that remaining occupation does go up. I mean, it's marginally significant for the most part. It does go up, but still the overall occupation employment within that occupation is going down, in part because every occupation within that skill cluster is lower in terms of their total employment.
Now, Sam, we do have another question in the chat. Oh, sorry, Ed.
Okay,
We were kind of looking at it. Brad asked, can you remind us which measure of licensing you were using for these? Is it the Kleiner and Soltis measure or the second one you defined?
So the spillovers are the second one that I defined. The own occupation license effect is the Kleiner and Soltis measure.
Okay, and just so you know, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, excellent. I'm almost done. And you can see some of these employment effects differ across the size of the PUMA. So you see much stronger negative own occupation labor supply effects in those large labor markets. But you also see far smaller effects on for the spillovers. So what that says is larger labor markets are able to absorb the reduction in labor supply that comes from going into licensed occupations. And it may be that there are simply more outside options available to each of those workers deterred by a license because the labor market is more saturated, there are more jobs in more similar skill areas. In the small labor markets, we see this consistent, pretty large negative effect here. So for robustness, I've included the university licensed occupation as well as PUMA fixed effects. So what that does is it shifts identification to coming purely from PUMAs that share multiple state borders. So that's to say, is from my experience, like McLean, Virginia borders DC and Maryland. And so then the identification comes purely from those areas. What that says too is that unobserved characteristics of the local labor market are not driving the results. It's not that areas that happen to have higher licensing areas also just happen to have weaker labor markets or lower demand or something like that. I've also gone through and sequentially excluded each cluster. So I've estimated based, taking 20 clusters and say, if you exclude cluster 1, what does the estimate look like? Cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 4. And so it says to me that the characteristics or definitions of any particular skill cluster is not really driving the results. And I performed the same analysis with the state and occupation fixed effects using the CPS with log wage as the outcome rather than weekly earnings. And I get spillover effects and the wage premium that are almost identical. So what that says to me is the border sample and the weekly earnings and the ACS sample is not particularly driving the results either. So just to wrap things up, so monopsony power that could be underlying this stuff is not just a function of the outside option in a single occupation, but the ability to change occupations. So this Schubert et al. Paper from recently came out shows that the larger your outside options, even across occupations, is a really big determinant of your wage and the ability to switch. And the monopsony literature also suggests monopsony power is greater for women as well as for immigrants and smaller labor markets. And then also smaller labor markets may have some more concentrated product markets as well. So all of these things could be working together to produce this lower level of employment and wages in the remaining kind of excluded occupations. So in conclusion, raising these barriers, if you generalize them to more and more occupations, you may be hitting these unintended consequences that workers that are deterred by the license, not just that they're not gaining, but they're maybe worse off. So the negative earnings effects are 20% on average if everyone is licensed except their occupation. For some minorities, that's 40%. In conclusion, policymakers should be weighing some of those possible consequences. And those workers are not party to the negotiations that are happening between those political entities that are deciding licensing regulations, right? A welder is not party to the, plumbers that are making these, appeals to the state legislature. And so they may be negatively affected. I'm not able to measure local labor market monopsony power because I don't have firm level data. And I'm limited to some of this cross-sectional identification, but future work may try to look at those two head on with the right data. So comments, angry emails, totally welcome. Thank you so much for listening and for your questions.
We did get another question from Dawood, and thank you for joining us from Germany, Dawood. Dawood asks, you do have some different occupations, some self-employed, some not self-employed occupations. How relevant is the monopsony model in all of these occupations?
I haven't broken it down across occupations that may be more or less self-employed, but I can look at that and see. That may be a really good kind of sanity check to see if this model is really performing well. But that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
And Yair also has a question, and thank you, Yair, for joining us from Israel. Have you considered the diffusion of licensing between occupations in the same cluster? If I recall, the literature suggests that as one occupation is licensed, correspondent occupations are more likely to be licensed as well.
I'm not able to look at the dynamics. And so it may be that, say, if in one state, occupational therapy licenses are more stringent, that also means the physical therapy's licenses are more stringent. I would capture some of that. If the licensure of multiple occupations within the same skill cluster are correlated, then I would capture at least part of that in my skill measure, in my skill cluster share licensed, as long as it's looking at other occupations other than those two within the same skill cluster. And so I'm going to capture at least some of that, but I can't look at the dynamics of it because I don't have any time varying data to look and say, well, does occupational therapy follow an increase in the requirements for physical therapists, for example? So I'm not able to look at those dynamics, but I think that is a really important thing to consider.